Making simple stencil prints without a press. It's quite straightforward to make simple stencil prints without using a screen bed. One of the key simple ideas is to reduce your image down into a series of flat planes. What I've done here with this particular image, which is based on a Uinuglo painting, is I've run it through the cutout filter in Photoshop. That's enabled me to see the image in a series of flat colours. Equally, I could have made a collage which would have done exactly the same thing. What I've done is I've subsequently made this image and then placed acetate on top of the image, and using a marker pen that draws on acetate I've drawn around the image, and I've thought about each separate colour being a separate drawing. I've then cut out each of those as a stencil. This has given me 4 stencils. Now, in order to execute this image, it's a really good idea to think about layers, and I'm going to start by printing the whole rectangle a solid colour. So what I've done out of a piece of A2 paper is I've folded it in half to make a little kind of envelope like this, and I've decided where my image is going to appear. So what I've done is I've laid my image to the very edge of my paper, like so. I've measured the gap here with a scrap of paper, and I've folded that in half to give me that image in the middle. And so I've drawn out this rectangle, which is the same size as the rectangle of the image, and then I've cut this out. Now I'm going to be stenciling through this, so the card is going to get wet. So in order to protect the card, I've put some brown parcel tape down. Now if I now take a sheet of paper, which is obviously A3 size, and I place this inside the envelope, and I lay this top down, if I print through this, I'm going to print a solid area of colour in the right position. And so I'm just going to talk through the simple printmaking technique. I'm going to use one of these kitchen sponges, kind of scourers on the end. They're very, very cheap to pick up. And I've put some acrylic down on a piece of plastic. A bit of acetate taped to my table is fine. Now I want to take a small amount of acrylic on the end of my sponge. I don't want to add any water, because water will cause my paper to cockle underneath. And I'm going to simply dab through this shape. Now it's important that you think about how you print through this rectangle. You don't want too much paint on the end of your sponge. If you have too much paint, it has a tendency to bleed under the rectangle. Equally, you want to dab from above to create a sort of fairly consistent colour. If you try to get into the corners, that also has a tendency to squish the ink, paint, etc. underneath the stencil edge. You can decide whether, when you're doing this, to print a completely solid colour, or you could, of course, print a gradation by simply sort of, printing and not recharging. You can print more than one colour in this. The beauty of this particular printing technique is that you can produce fairly consistent results, but equally with the same set of stencils you could completely produce a brand new set of colourways for each image. Once you've printed that first layer, you're putting on the acrylic quite thinly, and you're putting it on without very much excess water, and that will dry fairly quickly. If I lift that back now, you can see I've established my first colour. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to print that background on a couple of other sheets of paper. It's really important to remember that when you're creating each individual stencil, when you lay your acetate over your image to trace it, you also make sure that you mark the 4 corners of your image. Once you've cut each of your stencils out, then when it comes to printing, you can lay your acetate underneath your original stencil and line up the corners that you've made. Once you're happy with the positioning of those, you can then sellotape that into location. You now know that you can lift up your card and bring your card back down again, and your stencil is always going to be in the same position. That way you can continue to print each of your layers in turn. And it's very useful to think that you print your backgrounds as solid colour, and then when you print your next layer you're printing that on top. One of the key things to think about is if you're trying to make one stencil exactly fit another, you've only got to be a slight millimetre out for there to be a visible gap. Whereas if you're printing a flat colour and then you're printing your stencil on top of a flat colour, you'll get a nice crisp edge. Of course, as I said previously, you could print your stencil in one colour, and when you come to put your background in for the next print you could decide to change colour. It's a very quick process to mix up the colour in acrylic and just quickly change it. So it's really important that you make sure that you wait for each layer to dry. If you try to rush this, you usually get into all sorts of problems, particularly when the plastic stencil starts to get ink on it underneath, then that starts to transfer itself to other things, obviously usually in the wrong place. So patience is always a virtue. Again, however, the amount of acrylic that you're using is very minimal, and you can produce quite subtle results, particularly if you play around with different kinds of layering of colour. It might be you're mixing 2-3 colours at once. So you can now see we've got a third colour onto the print, and again I'm just going to continue to print that until all those are done. It's important to remember that you can wash your sponge in between each colour layer, but obviously the sponge will be slightly damp, so it's a really good idea to remove some of the excess moisture from the sponge using a kitchen towel. If this is too wet, again it will cause the paint to bleed under the stencil. So this is going to be my last colour, and again I've got the opportunity now to bring the print to a conclusion. In this instance I've pretty much kept to the same colourway for all the prints, but I could have decided to make each one individually different. If you do make a mistake in your stencil cutting, then a quick repair can be if you put sellotape in between both layers and then re-trim the sellotape. If we now move that back, you can see the finished stencil print. Once again, simple registration means that I can repeat that process over and over and over again as many times as I wish. Of course, you've saved all of your stencils. You don't have to throw them away. If you keep them somewhere safe, you can always reuse them and make another set of prints, or change the colour up. If I mix PVA with my acrylic, then I could make my acrylic more transparent, so I could also play around with transparent layers. And that's basically how you make a simple stencil print.